listener production.
Hey, Bension Siebert here with The Briefing. What kind of government do you want? Do you want a powerful government that makes promises at the election and has enough MPs in Parliament to turn those promises more or less directly into laws after the election? Or do you want a government that has to negotiate, listen to other perspectives, make compromises, and the result of all of that process becomes the law of the land? If polls are anything to go by, Aussies have had a gutful of government type A, that is majority government. They are sick of its shit, and they're ready to give government type B, minority government, a go. The big parties, Labor and the Coalition, are unsurprisingly not keen on this development, and the government is pushing a law through Parliament right now to reform our national elections. The government says this new law would stop billionaires having too much influence on our elections. But independent MPs say it's really aimed at making it much harder for them and new independents to be elected in the future. It's a battle over the future of the country. So who's going to win and what will it mean for regular people? Independent MPs Allegra Spender and Chaney join me from Parliament House in Canberra. Allegra, Kate, welcome to The Briefing.
Thank you very much, Bension.
Yeah.
You've both complained of a stitch-up from the major parties over this electoral reform bill. What is this stitch-up and why should people listening to this care?
The electoral reform sounds like a really boring topic, but basically it determines who gets into Parliament to make the decisions that we need made. So it's pretty fundamental to solving a whole lot of different problems that we face. And what we're seeing now is a package of changes that are dressed up as reform, but actually may well have the effect of locking in the two-party system and stopping people from having choice about who represents them.
The Labor Party argues that this bill is going to take big money out of politics and stop a billionaire like Clive Palmer, for example, having more influence than they should have. What's wrong with that?
I think that's a great idea, and I think we do need that. What we also need, which is covered in this bill, which is good, is transparency. At the moment, you don't know who's donated to political candidates until months and months after the election. And I think lots of Australians think you should know where the money's coming from before the election so you can decide whether you think it's affecting in whose interests those politicians are acting. So transparency is really important. We absolutely need to prevent individuals from having too much impact on our political system, but they've bundled it up with all this other stuff, including spending caps. Now, spending caps sound like a great idea. There's too much money, spent in elections and everyone gets sick of seeing the signs. But ultimately, there are all these advantages that parties and incumbents have that individuals don't have. And the way these spending caps have been written, it doesn't address any of those. And in fact, it makes some of them worse. So, in theory, if 10,000 people gave me $100 each, why shouldn't I be able to spend that on an election campaign?
Look, and I just want to add something. I want that big money of Clive Palmer to get out of politics, but we need to make sure that whatever changes there are to electoral reform, you still allow that competition. The major parties are the Coles and Woolies of politics. They are trying to sort of stack the system so that, they can, advertise wherever they want, using their big sort of labels. But as an independent, you would be restricted to how much you can advertise. And I think those are real challenges. So the government tried to rush this all through before Christmas without a Senate inquiry, could have done the Senate inquiry over the break, didn't, and now appears to be trying to rush it through again in the new year. And I think that shows this sort of, lack of good faith. If you're really out there to protect the Australian people, to make sure that, this is better for democracy, then what better way to make sure it's better than democracy than make sure it has this full transparency and accountability and integrity of a public inquiry on the detail of the bill.
And when we're changing something as fundamental as who can get into Parliament, it seems like it should have scrutiny. So the fact that they're rushing it through speaks volumes about what impact they think it will have.
Mining magnate Clive Palmer, who we've spoken about, is not the only person who's got a lot of money and who spends it on politics. Would the Teal independent movement have been possible without Simon Holmes Court and the Climate 200 group?
So Simon Holmes à Court established the Climate 200 group, and then the Climate 200 group has 35,000 supporters from across the country who think that the two-party system is failing us. Simon Holmes à Court put in 2% of the money into Climate 200, but gets a huge amount of credit for, people call it his money. And maybe it wouldn't have been. And I think one of the things coming in as a new challenger, it's really hard to take on a major party. It's expensive, it's challenging, you don't know where to start. And so I think that support from Climate 200 has been definitely instrumental. But ultimately, we should have a system where if communities want to be represented differently, they can be. They can choose someone other than the two parties. And we've seen the share of vote for major parties decline over a generation from 98% to about 2/3 now. Neither party's done anything that would arrest that decline. So instead of trying to win back voters with policies, they want to change the rules and stop new competitors. And we don't let Coles and Woolies make the laws about supermarket competition, but Liberal and Labor are making the rules about who can compete with them.
Clive Palmer has flagged that he will take a challenge to this law to the High Court, basically on the basis that if you spend money in an election, that's the same as free speech. And that would put us in a similar situation, I guess, to the US, where people can spend unlimited amounts of cash, huge amounts of money. Is that a direction that we want to go in?
I think there's a real problem when you have people who come in and want to change the outcome of the election individually with money. And I've put up 2 pieces of legislation on this. And one of them that David Pocock and I put up at the same time last year had what we called a mega donor cap in it that said no one person should be able to spend more than 1 or 2% of the total public funding that goes into elections, so that no one can have a disproportionate impact. In theory, I don't think there's a problem with spending a lot of money if it comes from a lot of people. The problem is when it just comes from 1 or 2 people. And so there are ways to do this that don't involve creating these spending caps as well. The other thing we haven't talked about is public funding. The huge change in here as well is a massive increase in how much taxpayers have to pay. So they're saying instead of you raising it from donors who think you've got something to present to the country, taxpayers will pay instead. And they're proposing it goes up to $5 for every vote that you got in the last election, which then creates this war chest that major parties can roll over to the next election. It also involves an increase so that there's $30,000 in admin funding for every MP, no matter how many MPs you get. So there's a huge war chests and slush funds that the parties can use, and they'll get some votes in seats that they spend no money in at all. So then they can harvest the money from that seat and spend it in the contestable seat. So it makes it basically voters that are being asked to pay more in order to have less choice.
Shouldn't elections be taxpayer funded? Isn't publicly funded elections a better idea than lots of private individuals funding candidates?
I can see there's a lot of inherent kind of attractiveness in that as a concept. And, I look at the US and go, God, I don't want to be in that country in terms of how the elections are funded. I think that question really comes down to how does that taxpayer funding work? Because if you've got taxpayer funding that basically only goes to major parties or to people who already have seats, then my question is that taxpayer funding actually creating competition in the system, generating opportunity for people to be represented by different types of people, or is that just entrenching power to those who already have it? Should the money we all sort of have to pay to the government be going to services or should be going to elections? But, if you say, yes, some should go to elections, the question then should be, well, how to do it in a way that's best for the electoral system? And that's kind of, for me, the fundamental question. And I'm not against the major parties having sort of taxpayer funding per se, but I don't want it to be used in a way that means that other players can't have a chance to fight for seats. And I'll come back to the kind of point on independence. It's like, why are a third of Australians not voting for the major parties at the moment? I think it's because they feel that, the major parties have not dealt with some of the biggest issues facing our country, say housing crisis, which has been building for 20 years when those major parties have all been in power at all levels of government, the climate crisis, where we're still fighting it out in these areas. So, so productivity, all these different issues. And the point is, I don't want a system system, I guess, that says, you know what, those two are the only ones who can make this work, I think it's important to have different voices. You know, I've got an issue with this bill, but it's not just sort of, I think, independents have an issue. Things like Centre for Public Integrity, other sort of groups that, you know, focus on how to strengthen our democracy have said, you know, we've got issues with this bill.
And I'd just add, taxpayer funding's fine if you're happy to just choose from the existing menu of A or B. But if you want one day to be able to choose something else, then there's a real problem with taxpayer funding.
If the polls are right, we're heading to a minority government where neither Labor nor the coalition will have the numbers to pass things through the parliament by themselves. They say this would be a recipe for chaos. What do you say?
I think that this would be a recipe for balance and common sense. You know, what I've made a commitment to is to look at each piece of legislation on its merits. And that's really different to how the major parties operate because, you know, the first lens that they look at things through is through the balance of politics. And so, you know, I don't care where the good ideas come from. I want to back them based on the evidence and based on community engagement and what my community says that's important to me. So because of this sort of, you know, the wedging and the partisan politics, we're not dealing with the big issues that the people I talk to want us to deal with. You know, we've got a housing affordability crisis that's built for 20 years through this major party wedging. You know, we have climate policy that has been swinging like a pendulum for like the last 10 to 15 years. We need to get on with the job. And so there are so many areas that I think if we could actually have more sort of come back to the centre, come back to common sense and pragmatism and put the sort of policy and outcomes first rather than the politics, I think we'll get a long way. And I think that's actually an opportunity in the next parliament.
I think it's really funny that we hear this narrative that it's going to be chaos and uncertainty. If that means you have to convince a majority of the House that each law is a good law, that sounds to me like what Parliament's meant to do. What we get at the moment is one side gets in, they do their things, the other side sits back and throws rocks for 3 years and then they swap. That feels much more like chaos to me than having a bunch of people there who just want to see good laws go through and are willing to listen to ideas from both sides because they've all got good ideas and work constructively with both and make those laws better. That feels to me like what Parliament's meant to actually be like. If you've got a sensible bunch of people in the middle, we're not just coming up with random ideas about changes to legislation. They're based on what we're hearing from experts and stakeholders and constituents. So they are ways of making the laws better. Sure, if you've got people in the middle who just want to hold the government to ransom and not work constructively, it's a problem. But if you've got people there who will never be in government, so they're not thinking about chucking rocks at each other, they're thinking about how can we make this suitable for more people in the community, then I think you get richer, better laws than parties that are ultimately passing laws that are in the interests of the party rather than the majority.
Is that always the case though? I mean, you have One Nation, for example, among that whole group. It's not as if you're all thinking with the same mind.
If you've got people on the extremes on either side, then you actually just exacerbate the pendulum. If you've got people who are sitting sort of actually in the centre and sort of actually looking for sort of trying to be more centrist, trying to be where the bulk of Australia is, and the bulk of Australia is not with One Nation, then I think you have that ability to, you know, bring things back to the middle, bring things back to sort of common sense, pragmatic centre. And I think that is actually what Australians are really looking for.
If Australians do vote for a hung parliament and the Labor and the coalition have to negotiate with you to form government, what will you be demanding from them?
I certainly would be willing to talk to both parties and understand their vision for the future and certainly hear what their plans are on the issues that are important to my electorate, basically long-term thinking on housing, on tax, on climate, on inclusion, you know, creating the community that we want to be. But one thing that I think you can do as a crossbencher in that situation is improve transparency and accountability and make the system work better, because the big parties aren't going to ever want more transparency and more accountability, but let's make it work better for everyone, whether or not your community has the same values as my community.
And what I would say is whoever's in power, my approach has always been to say, take each piece of legislation on its merits, talk to stakeholders, consult with experts and understand what my community thinks. And when I asked a guy walking down the street in Bondi, a guy called Sean, and he still really encapsulated it for me for Wentworth. He said, look, I care about the natural environment. We live in a beautiful place. I want to preserve it for future generations. He said, I want to live in a kind society. I want to live, in a place, where people have a decent life. He said, and I'm a small business owner, and that's super important to me. The economy is really important. It's always important. It's really important right now. And so we need to make sure that we're making the right decisions for the economy for the future. Now, I've been pushing tax reform as a big part to say, how can we reduce the burden, particularly on younger working people, because they can't get ahead like their parents did. And that is actually a problem partly with the tax system, partly with the housing system as well. But we need to fix that. But there are other areas on saying, look, how can we help our businesses to thrive? We do want to find that balance between looking after our environment, looking after our community, and looking after our economy. And we need to find that sort of balance between the three.
If climate change is a kind of red line for both of you, something that is of top tier importance, does that mean basically we could expect you to go with Labor in a minority government negotiation?
Look, I've been very explicit to say I will work with both sides on this, but obviously the climate is a really important issue. So frankly, what I really want to see is bipartisan action on climate, and I want to see the stopping of the sort of politicization of climate. It should not be something that we are arguing on, and we have ideological issues about this as a scientific issue, and then it's up to as an economic issue. And I think that's what I really think, where we need to get to, and that's what I will continue to push.
I'd agree. There's no reason that protecting the climate should be a left issue. I'm from Western Australia, and in WA, we have huge economic opportunities in a decarbonised world, global economy. And we have to seize those opportunities now and make sure that we're guaranteeing the next wave of prosperity out of renewables and critical minerals and hopefully green metals, and help the world on its decarbonisation journey in a way that will make us essential globally. So I see a very strong economic case for being ahead of the curve, or at least keeping up on climate, rather than seeing it as being some fringe issue. And I think there are a lot of people in my community who don't see that the economy and climate are in conflict. We need to address both of those things, and that creates some great opportunities for us.
Well, Kate Chaney and Allegra Spender, thanks so much for joining us on The Briefing.
Thanks so much for
having us, Bension.
That was Kate Chaney, independent member for Curtin, and Allegra Spender, independent member for Wentworth, speaking with me there. Thanks for listening to this episode of The Briefing. That's it for now. And have you decided yet if you'll vote for a major or minor party? We'll put a question in our broadcast channel on Instagram at The Briefing Podcast, where you can tell us what you think. You can also check us out on TikTok and YouTube. Just search Listener Newsroom. I'm Bension Siebert. Catch you next time.